I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the Cedar Rapids Gazette and ITC Midwest to this session of Iowa Ideas. My name is Randy Evans. I'm the Executive Director of the Iowa Freedom of Information Council. Before moving to this position 9 years ago, I spent 40 years at the Des Moines Register, primarily in editing roles. Local news organizations represent an important connection between their communities and the residents and businesses in those communities. Significant changes in the economics of local media have led to reductions in the number of journalists and in the number of news outlets across the United States. Today, we will examine what is happening in Iowa and the effects these changes are having in communities large and small in our state. There is a consensus, I think, that these changes are contributing to polarization, to reduced citizen engagement, and to less oversight and government accountability. Joining our conversation today are five very talented and knowledgeable people. Anna Brugman is the policy director at Rebuild Local News, a national nonprofit organization that is working to reduce and reverse the trends that we're talking about. Anna, give us a wave.
Hi.
Debbie Anselm is the executive director of the Iowa Newspaper Association, which represents Iowa's 240 plus newspapers. Debbie, for many years, was a newspaper publisher in the Midwest. Debbie?
Morning.
Thank you. Jeff Wagner is the president of Iowa Information Media Group, a 60-year-old family company based in Sheldon that publishes newspapers, magazines, and advertising guides in about 20 communities in northwestern Iowa. Jeff's Northwest Iowa Review is the largest circulation weekly newspaper in our state. Jeff? Eric Hansen is the news director and morning show co-host at KZIA Radio here in Cedar Rapids. You may not recognize his face, but I'm sure you recognize his voice. Jeff?
Yeah, close your eyes as I wave. Just listen to my voice instead.
We want to, I forgot one of you. And Zach Kucharski is the executive editor of the Cedar Rapids Gazette and its affiliated newspapers in about a half dozen communities in eastern and southeastern Iowa. Zach?
Howdy.
We want to invite all of you in our audience to submit your questions through the chat function. We will try to get to as many of these as we can in the next hour. To begin our conversation, I want to turn to you, Anna. Help us understand what is happening in local news across Iowa and the United States these days.
Well, I would certainly defer to Debbie on what's happening in Iowa specifically, but I can kind of paint a broad picture for you in terms of what's been happening to local news outlets over the past 20 years. Since about 2004, and that's about when we seriously started studying the decline of local news across the United States. We've lost over 2,000 newspapers. That's a rate of about 2.5 every week. For every one of those for every two of those newspapers that close, optimistically, there is a digital-only news outlet that launches. About 50 to 80% of digital news outlets achieve sustainability. So we're absolutely seeing innovation of the field in terms of business model innovation, the ways that both commercial, nonprofit, and hybrid models are emerging throughout the country, but it's still not enough to make up for the sustained losses to what have been kind of the bedrock of public information for the last many decades of the United States, which is the local newspaper. A large amount of the losses have been among weekly newspapers, which serve typically more rural, suburban, exurban communities. And that's why we see a lot of the losses of local news, what we call news deserts, counties without a single local news outlet, whether those be a newspaper, a digital only outlet, a radio station based in that county. We see that trend, particularly among rural counties. We see that folks who are live in communities that are below average in terms of income, below average in terms of education, speak a language other than English, are more likely to lose their local news outlet and become news deserts. And in these news deserts, what 20 almost plus years of research now shows is that all the things that make communities healthy begin to trend in the wrong direction. And that is around things like voting participation and participation in elections, period. Elections actually become less competitive. Incumbents are more likely to win elections. Residents are less likely to be able to name their mayor. They're less likely to even Google their mayor. They're less likely to be able to put their representatives on a political spectrum, whether that's conservative or more progressive leaning. The fundamentals of democracy just start to fall apart. Governments tend to increase taxes. There's more government waste. You're actually more likely to experience an ecological disaster if you live in a community without local news, because there's no news outlet that's watching large corporations. There's been some early research that was publicized in Stat, a healthcare publication, that shows that diseases are more likely to spread in areas without local news, because there's fundamentally just no one asking the basic question of why had we had X amount of cases of Y disease in Z amount of time. But also feelings of community connectedness. And I think this is, we talk a lot about the democracy of it all, but that feeling that you have of connection to your community, that you know your neighbors, that you're proud of something your community did, that you know how to participate in community events, all of that starts to decrease as well. And I think that's just fundamental to so many communities across the country, whether they're hyperlocal neighborhoods in metropolitan areas or rural communities or some combination thereof, anything in between, that the way we feel about our community, who gets to tell our story, whether it's us or somebody else, is so connected to the health of that community. And it's kind of ineffable, which is why I think we talk a lot about what we can measure: voting, taxes, likelihood of disasters. But that's so central to what happens in communities when we lose local news, and so central to why Rebuild Local News is working to counter that decline through smart public policy. So I'll pause there. I've painted a national picture, but I don't deign to tell the Iowans what's happening in Iowa.
Thank you, Anna. Debbie, can you give our audience, who are mostly non-journalists, I'm guessing, a picture of what is occurring in Iowa, and why should our audience be concerned about the economics facing owners of newspapers and broadcast stations when their own businesses and their employees are facing a wide range of challenges as well?
Well, good morning, everyone. There's it's a challenging landscape for sure, but there's some good news in Iowa. So let me first start there. We are one of only 5 states in the country that does not have a news desert, meaning we have a newspaper today in every single one of Iowa's 99 counties. So that's a really strong position for Iowa to be at. Building on Anna's comments, I think in large part that's because of what the word local means. And when you test local news, that has a more optimistic response rate than just national media in terms of people's trust. I can tell you, coming from a newspaper where we tested that theory about being connected in our market, it came back very strong that people who no longer subscribed to a paper no longer felt connected to their community. So while the path forward is challenging, there are paths forward, which is really good news. What I will tell you is that of our 241 newspapers in Iowa, about 78% of them have a digital website. We don't necessarily in local news have an audience problem. We have an economic problem, to your point. And I believe it's based on two things. The first one is the retail, the local retail markets. So walk up and down your main streets in every community across Iowa, and you can tell whether there can be a healthy retail base that can sustain a local news outlet. The second piece of that is something that you see being talked about across the country, which is the impact of big tech, basically taking content that local news outlets produce across this state and across the country and using it without permission and without compensation. And so that's the real ad revenue problem, and then the business revenue problem for our members. And why it's important is because that's revenue that used to come to your local media outlets, be spent and invested in your local communities, and now instead is going to big tech, and we never see those dollars again. And as someone who a year ago was in the field, I can tell you that every digital dollar that was spent on our website was well invested, gave returns, and we would spend that money in communities. When people bought our site through ad tech platforms, 75, 80% of that money went out the door, and you're looking at a very different margin to work with. So I'll pause there as well and see if there's any questions.
So, Jeff, your family has thrived in Northwest Iowa for, as I said, 60 years. You're involved in communities large and small. How do you see the current picture in your corner of the state? Is this economics? Is this the public reacting to kind of the national impression of the media? What's the situation in Northwest Iowa?
Well, I think, Randy, you've asked two different questions there. One is, what's the public's perception of it? And secondly, being, what is the economics of it? The economics of it is that inflation's hit newspapers harder than it's hit probably anybody else, with postage being up, 50% in the last couple of years, newsprint going to all-time highs. We're seeing that salaries are huge. And as we're seeing a generation coming to an end that's worked at newspapers for many, many years, or any media outlet, for that sake, that had an expectation of a certain income level, and the next generation coming along does not want to be employed at that same level. It's no different than we're seeing in the grocery industry, as small grocery stores are closing, and they're not being able to find somebody to buy that. And so we have a generational shift that's taking place in our industry. Randy, we print. We also have a printing operation that prints a lot of newspapers. And so we're seeing and hearing from them and what they're struggling with across the Midwest. And the common denominator is that we can't find employees. And we can't find employees for the salaries that we can afford to pay them. There's small papers that people are living, they were making $30,000 or $40,000 a year owning a newspaper. And now the next generation they're trying to get employees to come in for won't move to a small town in Iowa for those kind of salaries. And people will say to me often, is there a future in newspapers? And I always ask back same question back to them, is there a future in rural Iowa? It's a reflection of what we're seeing happening. The other thing I like to say is that community newspapers' role is to put unity in community. And without the unity of a community, a newspaper will never succeed. And local means I know the person. So as we become less of a community, we have less unity in our community, and we have less connection in our community. As you said, Debbie, if people don't feel connected to their community, they don't subscribe to something, which also makes them move on to the next community much quicker. So while we struggle with trying to figure out what is the future of newspapers and how do we make them work, there's a parallel problem going on in just what is community in rural America. And I'll just finish with this. If you look at a lot of those news deserts across the state of the United States, Iowa has 99 counties. So in Iowa, the size of a typical county is a lot smaller than in Nebraska or in Texas. So the likelihood that somebody has a connection to that county or that county newspaper is probably greater. It is, I would suspect, is why we're seeing a slower degradation of the number of newspapers we have in Iowa compared to others. But also remember this, Iowa has more libraries per capita than any other state in the nation.
Thanks, Jeff. Zach, from your perspective, how do you explain the current trends to the people in Cedar Rapids?
Well, I think that the trends are, as Debbie mentioned, there's economics that are involved, and so when you see, um, there are decisions that have to be made. There are fewer people that want to deliver a newspaper in the middle of the night at a rate that we can afford to pay. When fewer people subscribe, in some of those areas, the routes cost more. Gas goes up. Those types of things. The costs have been very real. At the same time, you're trying to continue to cover many topics. The other thing about it is that we're in a shift. And so when you subscribe to a print newspaper, those subscribers pay more. And when you're fighting for attention in a digital space, the margin that you get on a digital subscription is smaller. And so these things have shifted. When you have a lot of local businesses advertising, you have a lot of local revenue for that. When you have fewer locally held businesses, you have fewer dollars being spent in that community. The same is true for subscribers. When you have print subscribers, they're valuable. We have, I know you're getting to Eric, but even the shift of radio, I think that those trends would be universal between the health of the businesses and the advertising side of the coin. And so I think as you see this shift, you're also having to kind of live in both worlds, because we are serving people that some never touch our newspaper each day. They consume us entirely on their cell phone. Others still are completely dependent on having a print newspaper, and so you're trying to serve both, and it's exceedingly it's a challenge.
Thanks, Zach. Eric, you've spent your career in broadcasting. We've talked a lot about newspapers so far, but I'm guessing that broadcasters haven't been immune to these trends. What's the reality from your perch? How have these trends been affecting stations like yours, Eric?
So everything everybody shared across the panel fits us as well. It's a revenue model that depends on local advertisers to keep the lights on, to keep the power going on, to keep the microphones on. So we're constantly working both sides of that coin. From a programming standpoint, we don't see that as much, but we certainly hear when the sales staff is on the street and the challenges that they're facing, trying to get more advertising dollars for us. I think the other challenge from a radio standpoint, too, and I think Debbie talked about it, Anna talking about it as well, is where are people getting for us? It's where they're getting their music, their entertainment, and can we provide that product for them that works on both a content standpoint and also weave in some actual information that they need to know in their community. And I think as you had brought up concept of storytelling, Jeff, you were talking about the unity in community. That's the model we try to overlay, at least through our show and our radio station, to show that there's value between playing the songs that were plugged into the town. The town certainly rolls through us so that they do know the name of the mayor. And we have the ability to call the mayor if we need to talk about, heaven forbid, something horrible like a flood or a derecho, or invite them to do a ribbon cutting because we remodeled our office, which she was glad to do. So maintaining those relationships, I think, are really important. And also then being able to go back, taking that content and turning it back around and saying, hey, advertiser, this is the product that we have. The town flows through our radio station, and we're doing everything we can to show you how local we are and trying to maintain the importance of also showing local ownership. That's the trend I've noticed since I've been in the business. Going back to the late 80s, early 90s, it was locally owned. And then duopolies started showing up mid 90s, then these large radio conglomerates. And anymore, it's very rare, especially in Cedar Rapids, to still have a locally owned, locally programmed radio station. But I do think that does give us at least a little bit of a competitive edge, both from a programming standpoint and from a sales standpoint.
Thanks, Eric. I want to turn back to Anna. How do we go about fixing the problem that is ailing local news? This is what you're spending your time with, so I'm hoping you come with a lot of solutions in mind.
Well, I've joked before that I graduated from journalism school for the first time in 2016. And so like the writing was on the wall. And so any of my cohort that got into journalism, we had an extra degree of hubris of like, I see where this is going, but it's going to work out for us. And then I had the additional layer of hubris where I was a local journalist in Florida and Missouri. And then I said, oh, but I bet I could fix it. So it's a particular degree of hubris that I bring to this. But I do think that the local journalism sector is so innovative. And Debbie talked about those innovations. I mean, Iowa has a employee-owned newspaper. That's an incredibly that's amazing. And you know, a locally owned radio station that is incredibly unique. I study local journalism ecosystems in many states. There might be like 3 in any given state locally owned radio stations that are really grounded in local news and entertainment. And so as I talk about challenges, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that the local journalism sector is so innovative and so dedicated to its communities. This is not a story about an industry that is just, you know, wandering around and falling off a cliff without trying to create a parachute for itself. The facts of the matter is that parachute requires resources to build, and resources, for all of the reasons that were just listed among the panelists, are harder and harder to come by. It's not a matter of a lack of willpower. It's a matter of a lack of real economic resources. And that lack of resources kind of manifests at different altitudes. What Debbie was talking about was the 30,000 foot level. There is, by no exaggeration, a massive monopoly that owns and controls much of the digital advertising resources. And the Department of Justice is currently working through its case against Google and has shown that it has illegally consolidated the advertising market, that it's colluded with its competitors, that it charges large rents that are incongruent with the productivity that is offered to both advertisers and the folks who then take in that advertising, local news outlets, upwards of 20%. For those of us who rent homes, you can imagine if your landlord suddenly raised your rent 20% and didn't really update or make your living space any more livable. That's what we're talking about in the advertising space. And so at that level, at the 30,000 foot level, we have a structural problem. And then as we get closer to the ground, we have some of the issues. I mean, Jeff said, like, do newspapers have a future? Does rural Iowa have a future? A lot of the problems that we're encountering are as much entangled as the same problems that our community is facing. Main Street used to have 16 businesses and now it has 7. Well, that's now, half as many advertisers. Everybody mentioned local advertising as we're talking about. From Rebuild Local News perspective, public policy is an essential solution to discuss when countering some of these effects. It is by no means the only solution. You could argue it's not even the most important solution in terms of business model innovation, collaboration. There's philanthropy is becoming more involved in local news. There's many other solutions. We talk about public policy because that's our lane. And within that lane, we focus on public policies that create new revenue and resources for local news. There's lots of public policies that already affect the press, including public notice, public access, FOIA. We are laser focused on public policies that create more revenue and resources for local newsrooms across the country. And we do that as part of a broad coalition, the largest coalition of local news stakeholders across the country. We have 45 members, including the National Newspaper Association, digital onlys, unions, Spanish language pubs, nonprofits. We work really closely with journalism advocates and thought leaders at the national level, and we're all working together to create broad solutions to some of these problems. So I'll mention 2, and they kind of piggyback on some of the trends that were mentioned. Second for newspapers, second to infrastructure and resources. So, your print, your delivery, all of that. And that's kind of newspaper specific. The most expensive charge for news outlets is labor. And everyone mentioned that, we're not able to pay the wages that are now necessary to live in many places. Inflation hit wages very hard, and folks have to pay more. But news outlets generally aren't necessarily making more. So we've pursued employment subsidies in several states. They passed in New York. A very California version of it passed in California, but it's kind of the exception. And Illinois, which I think is more promising, is a more promising model for folks to pursue, that give news outlets either tax credits, or in the case of nonprofits, it's a formula grant for the hiring and retention of journalists. And I think that, if I were able to snap my fingers tomorrow, that would be the public policy I would pass in all 50 states. I would pass a federal policy valued between $1 billion and $1.5 billion to just flood the field with funds to hire and retain journalists. Because if you talk to a newsroom, the problem that they often mention first is, I don't have enough people, and I don't have enough people because I don't have enough money to pay enough people. And so if we're not talking about general operating dollars, if we're not talking about money, we are not talking about the problem. And so that piece of policy is the most likely, I think, to really infuse the field with general operating dollars that I think most folks in this room would use to go hire people immediately. And that's what most locally grounded news outlets would do with that money. The second is a policy that I hope will be introduced in Kansas this year. It's been introduced in Wisconsin, Colorado, and Maryland before. I'm really excited about Kansas's approach to it. So I hope, fingers crossed, that gets across the finish line. It's an incentive for small businesses to advertise in local news. And so in addition to there being fewer small businesses, our small businesses took a huge hit in 2020. And one of the first places that you cut as a small business, if your margins are getting smaller, is advertising. That doesn't set the small business up to reach new audiences, and it certainly doesn't help news outlets who were counting on those dollars. And advertising used to be the bedrock by which you would build a local news outlet. You could get 25% profit margins on an advertising business model. That's not the case, but it's a really important cornerstone to a sustainable local newsroom. And what I mean by sustainable local newsroom is one that is able to think on 5-year margins, not 5-week margins, which many news outlets right now are running payroll to payroll to payroll. And so we want to build a further horizon for the future of these individual local newsrooms. Local advertising is a huge part of that. So Kansas is likely to introduce a tax credit for small businesses to incentivize advertising in local newsrooms. I'm really excited about that approach. And I think it can cut across business models as well. WBUR in Boston bought out, I think, 12% of its staff, somewhere around there this year, largely because its local sponsorships didn't bounce back after the pandemic. This is a trend that cuts across business model, that cuts across audience, and cuts across geographic area as well. So I think by fortifying the relationship that local newsrooms have with their local economies, which is the question you asked earlier, Randy, of, well, why should, folks in rural communities care about local newsrooms when they can't even keep their own doors open? Local news outlets are essential to a thriving local economy and local community. They highlight the local businesses, they provide advertising, they cover them. They're real essential partners, they're real essential business boosters. And so I think that this can be a mutually beneficial policy as well.
I mean, one of the audience members is interested in learning more about this role with Facebook and Google sucking up the revenue and not compensating for their use of the content that local media is generating. Mm-hmm. Tell us more about that, Debbie.
Well, first of all, before I do that, let me just piggyback on what Anna said. There's, I think, some exciting movement going on federally around policy. Mm-hmm. And, I think all of us in our states and locally need to kind of embrace what's happening and add our voices to that. And one policy I would add to that is the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, which is really has some great movement. If you're not familiar with it, it's a bipartisan piece of legislation. We're hoping that it will have some movement out of the Senate yet this session. And what the act does is it just lets publishers negotiate with big tech. There's no reason for this piece of legislation to not go through. It doesn't take tax dollars. It doesn't cost people anything. It just really says that big tech has to sit down and negotiate with us collectively, which is the real key. What's happening is that um, you know, Google and others are selling advertising on our content, on local news outlets' content. So you see a headline, you know, you place advertising around it, and 90% of the digital ad revenue is now being captured in those ways by big tech. And so you know, at some point it was at 60%, it's gone as high as 90%. And those are, if you try to negotiate with Google on your own, they'll drop you in the rankings. So we're at an unfair advantage. And that's what the JCPA Act is trying to rectify. So I think that's the biggest path forward for us. And it actually has some movements and, like I said, to have a piece of bipartisan federal legislation is almost unheard of. It seems like these days. So I think locally we need to do a better job of sharing that message and why it's important for everyone on this call and anyone who's supportive of local news to be calling their representatives and their senators and asking them to join and support this piece of legislation. So I do think there's things we can be doing, but the industry has to do a better job of carrying that message, to all of our constituents and everyone who's listening to us. I'm not sure if that answered your question, Randy, but I wanted to make that point.
So, Jeff, you and your father have been at this for, as I said, 60 years. There's nobody smarter than Peter Wagner when it comes to finding a business model that will succeed. How do you sell your residents in Northwest Iowa on any kind of a role for government to be involved, whether it's with tax credits for local advertising or whatever? How do you sell that to the people in Northwest Iowa?
First of all, I want to say one of our problems was just bad salespeople as an industry as a whole. I heard Anna talk about the fact that, the length of, is there a future in journalism? Is this where I can ride out my career? But we live in a world today that the average tenure at a job is 2 years. So why aren't we talking about the fact, give journalism a try? Most people don't stay in the same career forever. So it's not like journalism is the only place you start and you finish. And I think that we've been proven that journalism is a launching pad for a lot of other careers and a great foundation for citizenship. I think that what's happening in some of this legislation is not exciting, but necessary. And so I think that we have to do something. And people will say, why should the federal government get involved in funding journalism? Is what you asked me. And my answer to you is very simple. And that's that we live in a country that we love living in because of what our forefathers created, right? 200 and some years ago, this nation was founded. And one of our founding forefathers, Thomas Jefferson, said, if I had to choose between the free government and a free press, I would choose freedom of the press. And so I don't think we have to defend our government giving money to support journalism, because it goes all the way back to the very beginning of the founding of our country, saying that journalism is more important than anything else the government can protect. Yeah. So to me, that's a very simple statement to answer that. I am concerned, because you gave me the microphone, that the tax credits we offer advertisers become very difficult to explain to advertisers. And we've got a lot of companies today that are struggling to make a profit margin in the first place. So tax credits to them become very secondary, and they don't want to pay their tax guy any more money to try to file taxes with those. So I think that while it's a great idea, I think it's more complicated than in my markets we could take advantage of with our advertisers.
Okay.
Go ahead.
No, you finish. You're on such a great soapbox. I don't want to interrupt you.
The other thing that we talked about is that the news media as a whole is looking at tech enviously and seeing how they've grown. The problem is that tech, Amazon, to grow to where it is today, had tons and tons and tons of money invested in it and took losses for many, 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 many years to get to where they are today. And we don't have that funding ability, but think we can make money selling a subscription for $1 a month to fund something. And when do we really think that dollar is going to turn into something that's greater, that continue to sustain our journalism efforts that we're doing today? And so right now we're all competing with each other. It reminds me of going to McDonald's, and for how many years I went to McDonald's and paid $1 for a glass of pop. And they taught me it was worth $1. And at some point they raised it to $1.49, and I went, oh my gosh, this glass of pop was worth $1. Today it's worth $2, $1.49. I don't get it. You trade me what the value was. Now, the other thing I just wanted to share, as I was sitting here, I was thinking about Amazon. And Amazon came into my building the other day and wanted me to deliver packages in Sheldon, Iowa, within a 10-mile radius of my office. And they would pay me $2.50 a package to deliver it. And we as an industry struggle finding carriers. And we know that the value of a newspaper is getting it early in the morning and having it on delivery, dependable delivery. If Amazon can get packages delivered for $2.50, can we build a business model that we can deliver newspapers for $2.50 on a weekly basis type of thing? Are we fighting the wrong problems? And are we fighting each other? I like the fact that you made the statement of this isn't a 5-week, but a 5-year. And that's part of the reason we need the funding is we can't be looking for solutions that are short term to get us through the next payroll, the next 5 months of the next couple of years. I have to say that I tell people, call me Reverend Jeff, because the number of newspapers we've bought, I feel like I'm in a mission to save newspapers than I'm in a mission to be in business. And there's a fine line between those two. But as you can tell, I'm very passionate about this industry, as everybody on this board is. And somebody talked about mayors. Well, one of the problems with mayors in my community is my mayor doesn't want to be known. We've got communities that are now saying, city council, we went to the city council and asked, why did you vote on a certain position for that last chicken issue? And the council members, each one by one, responded and said, we're not going to comment on that. If you want comments on the chicken thing, you need to go to the city manager. Well, gosh, I didn't vote for the city manager. Maybe we need to stop voting for councilmen and start voting for city managers. And that's the scary part without journalism, is suddenly that power gets centralized in one individual and nobody even realized what happened. I'm going to be really bold when saying this. I have people coming to me all the time and saying, we have socialism and communism coming into our government. No, we have dictatorships. Interesting quote from me. Anyway, I rambled too long, but that's what we're protecting.
Jeff, I appreciate your candor. Zach, do we need to be more vocal in the message about access to local information and local news being an integral part of sort of preserving the American way of life, American way of government?
I think that there's a responsibility for everybody to at least understand the situation that's going on. And I do think the more that we can talk and explain it, the better it is. One of the challenges that we have is that, whether you're passionate about animals or whether you're passionate about uh, you know a vibrant downtown nightlife, those are things that we probably have a pathway or that we cover, and we're amplifying those messages through the products. That's, we always want more reporters, we always want more storytellers, because we want the community to know all about itself. It costs money to do that. I think the expectation and some of the challenge, there needs to be a willingness to pay some amount for news, because it costs something. We don't, get to go into a Hy-Vee and just start drinking milk. You'll be asked to leave or something else would happen. So I think the expectation to, just consume information it is a little unrealistic. On the flip side of that, it's only worth what you pay for it. And if we're left with, in the era of AI and everything else, if you're not paying anything for it, you're probably going to get pretty bad information. And so I think it behooves all of us to invest something, what we can, in supporting an information architecture. I say that as, somebody who's worked 25 years in local news, but I also think that the vibrancy of a community, as Anna brought up from the beginning, the vibrancy of a community, it's not a coincidence that places, where people care about what's happening are the ones where people are still active, where people can find that information. It's not a coincidence that, they're using the information that they find. And so I think that if you care, this is something that everybody needs to care about, because if you don't, you're not even going to know when the wool is being pulled over your eyes. And it's difficult. I think Jeff is right. We're bad at talking about ourselves and explaining some of these trends. And it's difficult. We deal with people every day, some on their best days and some on their worst. At the national level, you can get caught up in things. We don't have bodies to verify every fact at the national scene. We have as many bodies as we can find to verify facts at the local scene. And so sometimes people have reasons that they feel certain ways that they do about us. And we have to be fair and we have to be honest. But you also, it's difficult 100% of the time to always be right. And I think that this black-white issue, or that expectation too, these are not simple. The relationship at a local community is not easy. It involves sorting through a lot of complex relationships. That takes time, that takes trust. That's what we're spending our time focused on.
Anna, I can see that you're itching to jump in here, so jump.
Oh, no, I should not be given any more opportunities to keep talking than I deserve. So I defer to Eric.
Randy, I wanted to bounce around analytics. There's been a lot of great information. We're covering a lot. And it's more maybe observation than bold declarations like Jeff does. But from a social media standpoint, I rely on that as a method of marketing our format, our show. It delivers us content. We use it interactively from a Facebook standpoint, YouTube for videos. So that's a little bit of a challenging relationship, because I understand from the journalism and the information component, those are the ones who are profiting off of that. But at the same time, as the model is right now, it feels like we can't survive without them. At least our show couldn't. We're flowing things through there every single day from a Facebook standpoint. We're building audience, doing a lot of social media through YouTube. So that becomes challenging. Two, a lot of people on the panel work on a subscription-based model. Radio is not that. We're free. So we still need revenue to run what we're doing. And as I said, keep the microphones and the lights on, but we can't put a price on the content, because unless you're doing it some sort of public radio, let's do a radiothon. Right. That's not a way to approach it as well. So I like that idea of keeping certainly keeping it out there and keeping it free, but it does make it a little bit more challenging from a radio standpoint versus logging in on a phone or a computer to get my Green Gazette, knowing I'm having to pay for that information. And Zach, you brought up something too, regarding journalism and being in touch with your community. One of the unique aspects, I think, for what I do for a living is, though I'm faceless for 4 hours out of the day, people know me. I bring myself to the show. And when I'm out in the community or I'm emceeing an event or at Hy-Vee, not stealing free milk, I'm at least seen as a person they can talk to. And I think that also helps to continue at least build that trust. And as I think back to the name of the panel and the value of local news, being that I'm approachable, reachable, email addresses out there, texting the studio, I answer the telephone line when they call in. I think that at least gives what we're doing on the broadcasting side, at least from the radio standpoint, a little bit of an advantage, or at least is helping us further this mission along, because there's an interactivity component. Whereas with a newspaper, you have a byline and maybe some feedback, and then there's something printed 2 or 3 days down the road. We can react within 3 minutes of a Taylor Swift song, and I'm ready to give you an answer to a question somebody gave me. So it does give us at least a unique ability to pivot as necessary on topics as they come up. And I hope the audience really values that, and again, continues to build that trust and value in what we do from our broadcasting standpoint.
Yeah, Eric, I just want to jump in a second. Sorry, Deb. Maybe we're going to say the same thing, but there's also a legal obligation that some of us have to do that others don't. And so we've talked a lot about, we can't libel and slander someone. There's legal recourse that people have if we do that. Social media, the playing field, again, to that level playing field, because of Section 230 and the policies that have been around, I think it's the Telecommunications Act, they don't have that same legal responsibility to have factual information. And so there's a cost to producing factual information. There's a different, model when you can get, when you don't have to be factual, and you don't have to necessarily verify that information. And so I think, yes, there's absolutely the trust issue, but there's also a legal requirement that's a bit different there.
Debbie?
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback on something that Jeff said earlier about telling our story, because I think that's so key. I don't want anyone to walk away today thinking we're anti-tech or anti, digital platforms, because the fact is those platforms have allowed our local newspapers to reach a bigger audience than we've ever been able to reach. That said, it costs a lot, because a reporter used to prepare one story for a print edition. Now they're doing, social posts, they're doing video with it, and, and all the things. So to produce content that goes across multiple platforms costs more money, right? What we need to make people understand, though, is there is some rhetoric out there bailing out newspapers. That's not what we are talking about. We are talking about successful local news outlets who play a critical role in their community. And the biggest thing is, you might hate us one day and the next day you might love us. But the fact is, we're telling the ideas and the stories that strengthen our communities, and we're creating conversations, right? So we need to be telling that story and talking about our past for success, because philanthropic journalism is here to stay. And if we're going to get funding and support, people need to know that their dollars are going to be used wisely, and they're going to count, and they're going to matter. And so telling the story about what we do, how we do it, and where we're heading is going to be critical to whichever path individual news outlets follow.
Can I piggyback off that? Now I will talk. I think to Jeff and Debbie's point, to news outlets watching, or just people who are interested, there's wonderful resources for how to tell your story in a way that builds audience trust at trustingnews.org. So wonderful project, comes out of University of Missouri, now an independent 501c3, and it just has incredible resources. And a fundamental piece of how to build audience trust is, one, act like a human, not a news robot. All of these people on this call make journalism. Journalism does not come out of thin air. It comes from people. And in the case of local journalism, people who are deeply invested in the health and future of their communities. And so we need to reinforce that story. To Debbie's point of, we're not out, like, we don't hate tech. We're here because, tech revolutionized the information landscape and we can reach people that we would never be able to reach. I think an overarching argument for, there's several approaches to, including tech and supporting local news. One is the approach that Debbie's mentioned, the JCPA at the federal level. It's been adopted at the state level. There's things called digital service taxes that charge different kinds of fees and taxes on tech that fund different things. Maryland has one that funds schools. New Mexico has one that goes to the general fund. There's a couple approaches here, but an overarching argument is that, like, look, tech has done wonderful things. Amazon revolutionized our economy. Facebook, Twitter, they've totally changed the information landscape. I used to be a local reporter in Sarasota, Florida, and for the past 3 days, I've been in all of my old Facebook groups, keeping tabs on the people that I used to cover. And one, that speaks to how deeply local reporters care about their communities, because I've not lived there for 8 years, and can tell you every street that was impacted. But two, just tells you the ways that tech has, help not just local news outlets, but people keep in touch with each other. That being said, they also reinforced extremist ways of thinking with their algorithms. They've monopolized the digital advertising market, which has affected small businesses and local news outlets. And so what we have argued is that, like, yes, these are great things, but historically, when somebody, bulldozed a national park to build a railroad, they had to offset the harms that they cause. We do the same thing with mines. We do the same thing when you make a large subdivision. You need to pay an excise fee to offset the harms that they cause. There's certainly an argument for that here. I don't know if it's forever. Hopefully, we're able to regulate these large monopolies to the point where they don't have the market power that they do. To the point that Debbie and Eric are highlighting some of the deep imbalances here. You can't negotiate with Google because Google will outlawyer you every time. Yet you need Google because for broadcasters especially, you need YouTube to reach people. And so hopefully that imbalance won't exist forever. But for the period of time it does, we need some sort of public policy remedies at this 30,000 foot level to address that. And I think that that's really trenchant and necessary in this moment. And then working down in altitude to the point that Jeff made earlier, that many of the small businesses in his market have problem making margins at all, let alone getting a benefit. I think our public policies need to be responsive to the communities where they're needed the most. And so we've looked at small business advertising as grant programs. How do we leverage existing funds to give grants directly to small businesses to then spend in local news outlets? There's been 3 cities that have addressed or pursued a similar policy: Meriden, Connecticut, Henrico County, Virginia, and Taos, New Mexico. All 3 have been deeply successful. And in the case of Taos, New Mexico, was so successful it kept them from laying off a reporter during the pandemic. But I think that the point that's been made of this first step, when the question is so existential, we need to take together. I think that, Jeff, you said that we're looking at the wrong problems and in some cases fighting each other. They're, news outlets, journalists, we're not historically the best at working together, especially across mediums and across outlets. But this first step, when the question is really, are we going to be able to serve our communities? Is there a future for rural Iowa? And is there a future for rural Iowa journalism? We really need to take that step together, I think, because in the issue of public policy, that's the business of making public choices. And when you're making public choices on behalf of a democratically critical field, you're making public choices about the degree to which our communities are going to be healthy for decades to come. And so we need to take that really seriously. And we need to make sure that our finish line is not, well, the person I hated the most lost, so I win. The finish line is, are we able to serve our communities? Is everybody able to serve their communities? And is every Iowan and is every citizen in the United States able to access information that they can use to make their communities better?
So, Zach,
Thanks, Debbie.
I would ask you to give us some examples of, you know, stories or issues, topics that you're aware of that have come to light that wouldn't have come to light otherwise were it not for the spotlight that local media was shining on it. Because, I mean, when you come right down to it, that's what all of this conversation is about. What people wouldn't know were it not for the media. Your reporters are all over Eastern Iowa. What are some examples you think of?
There are examples that come up so frequently that you have to even be talking to the reporters to understand the origin of every story that they pursue. Many are driven just by being plugged into the community and start with whether it's agenda monitoring, whether they went to the meeting or whether they watch a city council meeting that's been recorded. Back to that whole, there are values to digital. It's a very complicated relationship, but we've used it to be more efficient, and so you're able to grasp those moments, those interactions, and so you're monitoring. I mean, we've had a variety of city council stories come through just from that type of an introduction. It comes from monitoring or somebody providing, hey, I got this. This doesn't make sense to me. Could you help me learn more about this? That starts at the resident level every day. And so there are a variety of stories that generate, we are the eyes and the ears that are at different government functions all the time. Whether it's the school board and, wanting to secure funding or, change a tax rate or to, seek approval for something.
Close schools.
Yeah, close schools. That's absolutely something that has been a narrative.
I think of Debbie's former newspaper, the Quad City Times, which when the tragedy of the apartment building across the street from City Hall, when it collapsed, killing 3 people, it was the Quad City Times that used its spotlight to show what had gone on and been brushed off, complaints that residents of the building had been making to city building code enforcement people. Jeff makes reference to the raising chickens in a small community issue that where the issue was hashed out among council members and city administrators before there was ever a meeting held, and they had known what they were going to do. It's big stories and it's small stories. We're running out of time, and I guess one of the
Randy, can I say something?
Yes, you can.
I think things happen very slowly all of a sudden. And that's what we've seen happen in this. And it's really a question of the role of an editor versus an algorithm. It's kind of like the difference between a good diet and candy. We can consume because we like the flavor of it, but we don't really get fed something that's nourishing and ongoing. And, another example of this is public notices and whether public notices are important. And saying, well, we could just put it on a website and people go look at it. Well, the role of a media company that has actual news being generated is that we're telling you, here's the things that we think you are important, that you need to have a good diet to be a good citizen. And we will present it before you can choose what things you want to have, but we're not going to just feed you candy all day long so you can be in a sugar high and go talk to your friends about the woman or the man that did this or that on the internet. But so public notices are really, we're presenting them to you to say, hey, this is important for you to know where your city, your county, whatever is spending their money. Because who's going to know otherwise if the councils decided that instead of doing business with the local hardware store, they've decided to mail order from 2 states away.
Well, it's
And
the citizens are so busy these days that they, few of them have time to go hang out at school board meetings and city council meetings and county government meetings. And, that's what many of your employees are doing. And
let me say this, what Eric said real quick. The problem with staffing today is we don't have enough staff that the editor could even spend time to go out and engage with the community to build a relationship to say, here's who I am, here's why you should trust me, this is what I'm producing for you, and I see value in the content because I don't even know who you are. You're just somebody in the 3 states away.
Well, it's, I feel like we ought to turn back to Debbie here. We've got about a minute left. Is your blood pressure high? Is your blood pressure low? Where do you see your anxiety level going in the next 5 or 10 years?
I think I feel a sense of urgency to run down the path of building sustainable futures, right? And the timing is right, and the timing is now. And I think that there's some really interesting work and collaboration being done across the country. And we need to make some quick investments and figure out which of those efforts is really going to pay dividends and be able to scale for Iowa local news outlets. And I'm speaking about things like news and academic partnerships, content sharing opportunities, funding around certain types of coverage. And if we as the state association can play a role and get some of that stuff moving very quickly, we'll give all of us runways because we need to be successful, and we will be. But we've got a message to future journalists. We've got to build pipelines. We have so many key audiences we need to target right now that it's how do we do it all? How do we prioritize that? And how do we get it done quickly? I'm thankful that I'm in this role and not having to produce news on a daily basis and can actually dedicate some time to this. So my stress is around how do I make these things happen very quickly.
I want to thank our panelists and the audience for taking part today. I think we've run past our time clock, so thank you all for joining in.